We have had a very varied day with people presenting from all over the world and also on different topics. And I think the key conclusion that I make in one phrase is that humans are probably the most important element when we try to understand disease, whether it's moving ASF wild boar carcasses onto the farm or submitting insufficient samples to the diagnostic lab, or ignoring the advice on gilt acclimation and continuing to use live virus inoculation, for example, despite the evidence. And so with that, I think we can jump into the questions, because nobody wants to hear me. Everybody wants to hear your views. And I'm going to try and moderate the questions now that we've received. I'll try and follow a little bit the order of the day to make it fair. Dr. Deppner, I think you mentioned that humans are an important part of ASF control. And the question is, do you think in the current situation in Germany, perhaps we're not applying the lessons learned to best control the situation in those new cases that we're detecting in wild boar in Germany?
Okay, so may I repeat? So the question is if in Germany the lessons learned are applied or not in the new cases, something like that, in that direction. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. The lessons learned mainly, which I was talking about, were targeting domestic pigs. However, in wild boar situation is much more complicated. There are 2 points, or one important point. When you discover the disease in wild boar, often the virus has been already there for months, 1-2 months. And then the most important thing is to not to delimitate, to see where the infected area is. And I think that the Germans are doing now quite very well. That you can only do by finding carcasses. So the lessons learned from Belgium and also from Czech Republic are now more or less implemented and even improved in Germany. The problem which we face is that it's not a single introduction we see now. We have 3 introductions at the moment, which we can see at the border to Poland. And so the front of the ASF is quite biggish. It's not we are part of an endemic situation which is coming from Eastern Europe. So it's not a spot which are fighting. We will see if we can stop it. That is the main target, to stop the progress of the epidemic.
Great, thank you, Dr. Deppner. That's a difficult question for sure.
Yes, indeed.
Moving to Bailey, there's a couple of questions here. I think one you tried to answer in your presentation, but I think it's worth clarifying, is do you believe PCV3 is a primary pathogen? I think this is an often asked question.
I think we have evidence that it is certainly capable of causing mummies and stillborns on its own from cases in the field. So we've done pretty extensive and thorough investigations by litter and by case using histopath, really sensitive PCR, as well as next generation sequencing to detect things that we don't know of. And many of these litters or pools of litters come back clean with only PCV3 detected. Addition to that, we also have a really sensitive and good in situ that will detect that PCV3 within the lesions of those mummified fetuses as well as stillborns. So in that regard, with that case definition, yes, it is a primary pathogen. When you go out and look at maybe the growing pigs, I don't know enough to understand if it acts like PCV2 if you're looking at PCV2, really, PCV2 isn't a primary pathogen. It's not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You can't develop PCV-AD in an experimental setting well. If you give them KLH and stimulate their immune system, yeah, but it's still not necessarily like what we see from a field case. So not a lot of people are really familiar with that, but that's the way it goes. So PCV2 isn't sufficient on its own to develop PCV-AD. I don't know if the same is true for PCV3 in growing pigs or not.
Yeah, the picture seems more complex in growing pigs, while in reproductive disease, to my mind, there's a more clear case to be made with association of the pathogen to specific pathology. So, great. Just to follow up briefly on that, there's a couple of questions around relevance of different infections. So I'll just follow up with that. It's regarding parvovirus and the relevant importance of that disease in the United States, in your experience. We saw yesterday that certainly these new strains are emerging that are quite frequently detected in different European countries and in Brazil, but maybe in the US the picture is different. What's the prevalence or relative prevalence of parvovirus in the breeding herds in the US at the moment?
And I don't have a great answer for the prevalence of porcine parvovirus 2 or other porcine parvoviruses within the U.S. breeding herds. I can tell you that we diagnose porcine parvovirus reproductive disease fairly uncommonly. But again, we commonly just use PCR for porcine parvovirus 1. In some cases where we have mummies, we'll throw on a porcine parvovirus 2. And in situations where we see inclusions, so for instance, I've had one case where there was inclusions consistent with a porcine parvovirus in the spleen of a growing pig, and that ended up being porcine parvovirus 2 in that growing pig who also had a strep suis bacterial meningitis. So we do see that both are circulating within our U.S. swine herd and potentially causing some issues periodically, but I don't have a good idea as to a prevalence.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably not very much data globally to assess prevalence of reproductive diseases accurately, I would say. Thank you. Moving quickly to our guilt acclimation specialist, a question for Christian Haven, a clarification question. So in your 12Q model, how long are these gilts held in quarantine between the time the last gilt arrives and the first one comes out? If you could please clarify that to the audience.
The way that I do it is that I fill up the quarantine at the same day. So if it is, in my model, if it is the single 12-week quarantine stable, we also empty the quarantine at the same day, just 12 weeks in between. In the double 12 system, we of course fill up the compartment at the same day, but we allow them to take out 10 or 20 gills, 10 every week or 20 gills every second week, or whatever fits into the system. So the point here is that we try not to run a continuous flow, but instead run them as all in out systems to make sure that all this virus spreading is done in the beginning of the quarantine period and not at the end of the quarantine period.
Thank you for the clarification, Christian. I think this is a concept that a lot of producers struggle with when faced with the reality of the amount of space they need to commit. And I think that was a view shared by both of you with the two different perspectives. Maybe a question for both you and Dr. Clayton. what in your experience is the most common mistake? You cited a whole set of principles, and when you travel around the world, you probably see people making different mistakes or not applying the knowledge we have correctly. Maybe Clayton, you first, and then Christian. Which would be the most common sort of mistake that you see being applied out there, or thing they're missing when applying guilt acclimation?
Yeah, I'll start, Oliver, by just highlighting that good guilt acclimatization and development is really hard to do. So your goal is ultimately probably not perfection, but it's to make less mistakes than the competition. There's going to be inherently challenges. I would tell you, Oliver, probably the battle that I fight most often is helping producers see the big picture and the long-term impact of decisions that they're making, particularly around guilt flow and selection rates, versus the short-term gain that they can get taking some not ideal animals, some animals that for whatever reason we normally would not want to enter into the herd, and entering them into the herd. Those factors can be local and farm specific. It can simply be I have, a decreased number of wean sows coming and I need to hit my breed target. So I have to breed some extra gilts for a period of time. And I have to therefore, not really do any selection. I just take all the gilts that are still around at the end of the gilt development period, and any that come into heat, I breed them. That can also be more macro and country level. You think about some areas that are fighting ASF in their commercial pig farms, and particularly China and Southeast Asia, where gilts are simply not a luxury that most farms have. And any animal that's available to them, they're going to have to use and breed just to try to fill up their farms. Those aren't always battles that I win. So I tell you, Oliver, a lot of times I'm just trying to share my prognosis with the producer and make sure they understand that their expectations for performance of this farm for the next couple of years need to change. Take the 30 PSY number off of the target list, because we're not probably going to do that if we're entering in animals that we're just going to have to cull out after this, or that we know have small vulvas or some other problem that inherently represents a poor reproductive animal. But I would say that's the most common challenge that I run into, is farms that are in a situation where they feel almost beholden to whatever gilts that they have in the pipeline, and they must breed every one of those gilts that they can possibly get to come into heat at any size, age, weight, structure, previous reproductive history, etc. That's the biggest challenge I feel.
Okay. And Christian, what is your experience from seeing guilt acclimatization across the globe?
Well, I couldn't agree more that in what Dr. Clayton says here. I totally agree with him. That is also why we are focusing so much on raising the gilts the right way, because this is the sow material that you have to rely on for the next 2 or 3 years. So whatever mistakes we make on the gilts, you just get punished in so many ways for the next 2 or 3 years. Some of the mistakes are obviously 100% veterinary, like having too short acclimatization period for capacity reasons, like 8 or 10 weeks of quarantine stables using modified live vaccines that we know for sure that they are spreading or shedding the virus whenever they enter the farm. But we have the choice: do you want to vaccinate, doctor, or do you not want to vaccinate? This is my capacity. I have only 8 weeks of capacity. That is one mistake. Right. But I agree with Dr. Clayton that also the quality of the animals that are selected for their first service is not always okay. It is maybe 80 or 90% of them that are fit for fight. And that will for sure lower the quality in production results and the quality of the sows for a long time ahead. So that's why our main focus are on the quality of breeding these gilts and raising them.
Great, thank you both. Dr. Arruda, quick question. You mentioned in your presentation about litter submission, the importance of submitting 2 to 3 affected piglets, but in another part of your presentation, you talked about, more, even 4 piglets per affected litter. Would you submit normal fetuses too to balance out the pigs that show mummification or gross pathological lesions, or is it a waste of time to send healthy looking fetuses?
I would focus your diagnostics on those that are abnormal, so mummified fetuses and stillborns, and just starting with a case definition with 3 or more, right? And then, so if you have more, obviously submit more. So if you're seeing 4 or 5, 6, certainly you can submit those to a diagnostic laboratory as a litter, but at least starting with the case definition of 3 or more.
Okay, thank you. And if you can only take one sample, would that be thoracic fluid?
If you're going to pin me to the ground and tell me you can only submit one, yes. However, mummies don't have fetal thoracic fluid, so you can't get that from those. In the moderate autolysis, so like the brown kind of juicy fetuses, yes, you can get really great fetal thoracic fluid from that. But if you're looking at mummies, you can't. But you can just open those guys up and take their pluck out. So take their heart and their lungs out and ship that in a bag and run it for PCRs if you have a good lab available to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Question for Dr. Deppner. Coming from a colleague or a customer in the Netherlands, the regulations there state that if a farm is affected by ASF, then a farm 1 kilometer away should also be culled, even if there are not any clinical signs or detectable disease. Do you think that is necessary in light of your comment about the low contagious nature of this virus?
At least the European regulation that is not prescribing that. So it's some supplementary national regulation where you decide, due to whatsoever reason, so risk assessment that 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers surrounding your farm, you would like to kill all the pigs. It's something which has been done for classical swine fever in the past, because there was this neighborhood infection, but we haven't seen this kind of neighborhood infection for African swine fever. And as I told you, the epidemiology is completely different in classical swine fever and African swine fever. So we do not have this fast spreading of the disease from farm to farm as we see it with foot and mouth disease. So from the legal point of view, from the European legislation, at least, the directive for African swine fever just tells you to kill the animals on the affected farm, not in the surrounding of 1 or 2 kilometers. That's something that then risk assessment is done by national governments or regional governments, and they have other priorities to do that. Right.
Just a follow-up question. I think this was a critical part of your presentation, that the low nature of ASF means that it's moving slowly within a population, and therefore could potentially be exploited by producers to try and obtain, if you want, one section of a large farm and still farm. Is not agreeing with that, but in your experience, is that a technique that can be used to have to depopulate the whole farm, or is it often too late by the time we have detected clinical signs in those affected animals and the disease has already spread?
There were some interruption in your question, but I think I got the point. So the question was if we can use modified culling, not to cull the entire farm, only partially the affected stables or so. That depends very much on the point when you detect the disease. At the earliest, the better, and also on the management of that farm and on the surveillance. So if you decide only to cull, say, one stable instead of 10 stables. You should have a good system, a surveillance system, which assures you that the virus is not in the other stables already. And you have to have a good monitoring for the next 4 or 5 weeks where you make really sure that the virus is not there. There are some cases where it has been tried that way, and without success, the virus found the way to another stable. But also we have cases I heard from Asia where, or for Russia, they succeeded just to take out the pigs from the infected stable and not from the entire farm. So it's possible, but you need really a good management and a good surveillance. That is what you need. And then very early detection.
Thank you. We have many questions and not enough time, I'm afraid, but I'm going to add one more to Christian Haven. What is the best way, and maybe this is not the right last question, probably a long question to answer, but what is the best way to reduce leg problems in sows by rearing? What is the one factor from all those important factors you cited today, which would be, in your opinion, the critical one to reduce leg problems and culling due to leg problems in sows?
There are actually quite many, but if you want me to point out the one most important, I would for sure say restricted feeding strategies and keeping this growth level down on these 750, 800 grams of every daily weight gain. These animals, they have the genetic power to growing so much faster than their structures in the legs, tendons, bones, and so on can handle. So it's like the chicken syndrome. You know, if the chickens are slaughtered 2-3 days later than planned for, they're all sitting down. And we have more or less the same issue with the pigs, that if we want them to grow the slow growing tissues in a nice way, they need to grow slowly, less than their capacity, the genetic power.
Great. I'm going to have to stop now. I want to spend a couple of minutes just thanking all of our presenters today, Dr. Deppner, Dr. Aruda, Dr. Clayton Johnson, Dr. Christian Haven. Thank you very much. It's fantastic to listen to you and learn together on these important disease management issues. And to the audience for participating and being good listeners. It's always weird in these virtual meetings. We can see each other as speakers, but we can't see you. We hope this was valuable. We look forward to meeting again soon, both our speakers and you in the audience, when all these great vaccines that are coming hopefully will allow us to move freely again. So thank you much, and have a great evening, a great rest of the day, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.